Welcome back to another episode of Gamma. We're going to be continuing our series on the Sermon on the Mount. Today, we'll be doing chapter 6, verses 19 to 24, talking about our earthly treasure. There is a section prior to this on verse 16 to 18, which is about fasting, hypocrisy during fasting. We will reserve that for another day where we could give more justice to this big topic of fasting, but today we'll just concentrate on treasure. Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy, where thieves break in and steal. But lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven where neither moth nor rust destroys, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. The eye is the lamp of the body. So if your eye is healthy, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eye is bad, your whole body will be full of darkness. If then the light is in you is darkness, then how great is the darkness? No one can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he'll be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon. Basically, what Jesus is now confronting us with is something very practical. He's asking us the question, is it God or is it greed that's going to be in charge of our lives? The passage can be broken up into three sections. One, earthly and heavenly treasures. Which do we actually place as a premium in our lives? Verses 19 to 21. Then the second section is the necessity of having a clear perspective for us to make up that decision. Verses 22 to 23. And thirdly, there's an incompatibility between discipleship and greed in verse 24. So let's start off the commandment. Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth. So this is the first prohibition. Now notice the prohibition focuses on do not lay up treasures for yourselves. It's a hoarding of wealth on earth. And the reason is given. There are three reasons given here that Jesus prohibits us from accumulating wealth. Well, it's mentioned as because of the moths, because of rust, and because of thieves. Because in the context in those days, treasure or valuables are located in things like clothes, fine clothes, which are very difficult to make. And if the moths came, it would destroy it. Coins, which would be rusty and become worthless, and thieves who will break into your house and steal the precious treasures that we have. Destruction of wealth actually comes from the word inflation. Every year, if you look on year in year, the value of our treasure, our money which we actually have, actually becomes less and less. And one of the best indexes of this is basically the Big Mac index, the cost of Big Mac over the number of years. If you look at this particular graph, it's called the Big Mac index versus the Consumer Price Index. And you can see since 1986 up to December 2012, the price of Big Mac has escalated even beyond 173% from 1986 to 2012, even beyond the Consumer Price Index. The Consumer Price Index shows us over the last few years, all these years, money has already dropped by, it's already halved in value. It's 110% rise. But Big Mac has actually extended even beyond that. And the reason that has happened is because of a financial crisis in 2007, 2008. It was the banking crisis that people had subprime mortgage loans from irresponsible people, factors beyond our control. It's other people's greed, and that actually caused inflation to skyrocket. If you look at the price of Big Mac, it's really gone further up. So therefore, we don't have rust, we don't have moth, but we have greed from other people, we have inflation. This is another graph looking at the working time needed to buy a Big Mac. If you look at an average worker in Chicago, will take less than 20 minutes to earn enough money to buy a Big Mac. On the other hand, if you work in Nairobi, you would take 160 minutes before you earn enough money to buy that same Big Mac again. Factors beyond our control, the corruption of our country. So our wealth is actually quite tenuous. It can be It depends on so many factors that actually doesn't depend on us. I was in Ipoh several years ago, and I went for an actual exhibition, and the exhibition showed wealth in terms of fish, the flower horn fish. Beautiful fish, and some of these fishes actually retail for $50,000 to $100,000. See, the wealth is located in the fish, but there was a chap who actually took one of these and accidentally ate the fish up. There goes $110,000, or the fish could die. See, wealth today erodes. It's either eaten or it's inflated away, and so therefore it's actually a very poor investment. Now, if you look very carefully in this particular verse, Jesus is not saying that you are not to have any money or to have any savings, because if you look in Proverbs chapter 30, verse 24, 4 things on earth are small, but they're exceedingly wise. The ants are people not strong, yet they provide their food in the summer. So therefore, ants are actually here praised because they save. So nothing wrong in saving money for your pension or retirement. Or there's also nothing wrong in actually enjoying the food that you have earned with your hard work. Ecclesiastes chapter 2 verse 24, there's nothing better for a person than that he should eat and drink and find enjoyment in his toil. This also I saw is from the hand of God, for apart from him who can eat or who can have enjoyment. So therefore it is godly and a good thing. It's a blessing that God gives us, that we can find and eat and enjoy our food and drink from money earned from our toil daily. So what Jesus is actually against is a selfish accumulation of wealth for oneself. Do not lay up treasures for yourself. You see, what he's against is extravagant, luxurious living in a kind of hard-hearted manner that actually ignores the rest of the world that actually lives in poverty. 10% of the world actually live on less than 10 ringgit a day, and they struggle, and you have got a whole bunch of people, all of us included, where we are actually striving ahead and not actually thinking about them. It's the accumulation of wealth. And this wealth, the problem with this wealth is that it binds us, it tethers us to this world, and it prevents us from actually seeking spiritual values. So he's not prohibiting things, but it's actually prohibiting the love of things, because whatever we treasure, the things that we treasure actually have the power to govern our lives. Quite apart from that, materialism that we're all addicted to has a lot of terrible effects. In January 1848, James Marshall was building a sawmill by a river in California when he found a piece of glowing metal on the floor which actually turned out to be gold. The discovery triggered the now infamous gold fever. People abandoned their ships and shops and families. Whole towns were abandoned as everyone flocked to California. In little over a year, San Francisco grew from a shanty town of 79 buildings to a city of tens of thousands. Over the next few years, at least 300,000 gold seekers came to California. The effect on the Native Americans of California was catastrophic. They were driven off their traditional hunting and gathering grounds, and the rivers were polluted with gravel, silt, and toxic chemicals from new mines. Some Indian groups used force to try to protect their lands, but were massacred by the miners. Those who weren't killed by the miners slowly starved to death or died from diseases passed on by the immigrants. Others were kept as slaves, while young women were carried off to be sold. As a result, the California Native American population fell from around 150,000 in 1845 to 30,000 in 1870. Now, the modern day equivalent of this devastating effects of materialism occurs every time you put on an engagement ring. Across the world, a corresponding hand or finger gets brutally chopped off in the process of the brutalization of whole populations and forced labor involved in the mining of what we now know as blood diamonds. Diamonds mined during the civil wars of Angola, Ivory Coast, Sierra Leone, Liberia, Guinea, and Guinea-Bissau have been given this label. It's been estimated that over a quarter of all diamonds sold come from these conflict areas. You see, in our cities, we are constantly bombarded with advertisements that tell us to buy, buy, buy. Fashion used to be a seasonal thing with new styles out 4 times a year according to the seasons, but now high fashion is a weekly affair with 52 changes a year driving the consumer to buy, buy, and buy. Technology, cheap production from China has fueled a worldwide consumer boom. We even bombard our children with advertisements from the time they can walk or talk with 40,000 commercials per year, and in the United States they spend $12 billion to advertise to the youth. It would seem that every child is imprinted with a desire for materials. They grow up without a choice but to consume. In the end, we're so inundated with materials, it's clogging our oceans, choking our fish, and microparticles of plastics make its way into our food chain and slowly coming back to kill us. Forbes magazine, the premier publication of the most successful people in the world, had an article by Alice G. Walton in 2015 that revealed that the effects of this constant drive to material gain on super successful people. And this is particularly devastating psychologically. CEOs are depressed at double the rate of normal people. Some of the reasons in Walton's article include extreme stress of competition. CEOs habitually measure their self-worth by whoever seems to be more successful than they are. A recipe for constant depression-inducing envy. They sacrifice enjoying simple pleasures in life, like spending time with their families, which is the stuff that brings joy and texture to life. They feel detached from their former selves. They don't know quite how to identify themselves anymore. For example, one CEO said, "The bigger the bonus, the less I feel like myself." And their values change over time, and the industry is always trying to tear them down. Why do we do what we do? Why are humans intrinsically materialistic? Some psychologists look to Darwin's theory of evolution. Since natural resources are limited, human beings have to compete over them and try to claim as large as part of them as possible. However, for much of history, human beings have lived as hunter-gatherers, small tribes who would be nomadic, moving from place to place every few months, and they couldn't be weighed down by unnecessary goods, so they moved every few months. Unnecessary goods would be a hindrance to them, making it more difficult for them to move, which is against this idea of materialism. Another theory is that the restlessness and constant wanting which fuels our materialism is a kind of evolutionary mechanism which keeps us in a state of alertness. But there is no evidence that other animals live in this constant state of restless dissatisfaction. On the other hand, and on the contrary, that many animals seem to live very slow and static lives, content to remain within their own niche and follow their own instinctive behaviors. So this doesn't fly at all. Psychologists today believe that materialism is caused by inner discontent. So we try to seek contentment from temporary thrill of buying something new and the ego-inflating thrill of owning it afterwards. Hopefully this will satisfy us and compensate for the fundamental unhappiness inside us. In addition to this, we suffer from a sense of separation and a fragile ego, and we turn to materialism to make ourselves more whole, more significant and powerful, which is why former US President Jimmy Carter said that we are no longer defined by what we do, but by what we own. Today there's a counter movement gathering steam in the United States, started by Joshua Field Milburn and Ryan Nicodemus, where people have now started to reject materialism because people are starting to realize that life is more than the accumulation of material things. You see, both of them started saying that today's problems seem to be the meaning we assign to our stuff. We give too much meaning to our things. So we forsake our health, our relationships, our passions, our personal growth, and our desire to contribute beyond ourselves. Their solution: keep things to the minimum and only keep the most important things in life, and this will free us to do the things and concentrate on the more important issues in life. This movement is a very good start, but however, it doesn't go quite far enough, because whatever you focus on as an alternative, as your substitute, it will soon also be never enough to quell the inner discontent in our souls. You see, in 1971, two psychologists, Brickman and Campbell, first wrote about this concept of hedonic adaptation, which is a theory that posits that people repeatedly return to their baseline level of happiness regardless of what happens to them. They could have something happy happen to them or something sad happen to them, but whatever it is, within a certain period of time, they will always gravitate back to the midline. In fact, it was nothing new, because way back in 1754, it was a French philosopher, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who actually first noticed this in his discourse on inequality. He writes, since these conveniences, by becoming habitual, had almost entirely ceased to be enjoyable and at the same time degenerated into true needs, it became much more cruel to be deprived of them than to possess them was sweet, and men were unhappy to lose them without being happy to possess them. So what he means is that whenever we get something new, we find it enjoyable. After a while, we cease to enjoy them, but the trouble is we can't do without them. It's like a need, but we don't enjoy having them, but we're stuck with them. So that's addiction, isn't it? So here, there's some data on the relationship between money and happiness. And if you look in this graph, and after a certain level of income, more than $75,000 US per year, there's a diminishing return. The happiness level does not return back to normal. If you think this is just the United States, you'll be wrong, because the same phenomenon is seen in China, with its rapid development and wealth, which has increased 250% over the last 12 years. And life satisfaction graph and the dissatisfaction graph seems to both be moving towards the midline. The dissatisfaction turning to be more satisfied, the life satisfaction from satisfied becoming more dissatisfied. They'll move towards the midline. Jim Carrey, the famous comedian, once said, everyone should get rich and famous and do everything they ever dreamt of so that they can see that this is not the answer. You see, all material things, fame, family, you name it, it's only designed to bring you only so far. There's always a gap between what you have and what you really need to get complete satisfaction and happiness. The reason is because of our unique nature. We are created in the image of God, and unless and until we fully reflect Him in our lives, we will never truly be content. 10 years ago, a millionaire called Forrest Fenwick decided that he would fill up a whole chest full of treasure, weighed about 20 pounds, with jade and gold, worth $1 million US. And he hid it somewhere in the forest of the Rocky Mountains. And then he announced this treasure was somewhere there, and he gave clues by writing a long poem. And you know, the result of that was thousands, literally thousands of people gave up their jobs, life savings, actually went all over the Rocky Mountains looking for this treasure. 4 people actually died in the process of looking for this treasure. And last week, somebody actually found it. We don't know who it was. But the point is what Jesus is saying. For where your treasure is, there your heart will also be. If you perceive, whatever you perceive as your treasure, then that will actually take your commitment, your drive, your ambition, and every waking moment you're going to be able to give up things, sacrifice things, because your heart is actually drawn to it. Now the point is, what is our treasure? What is our treasure will be determined on what we see or decide as our treasure, which then brings us to the next verse. If the eye is the lamp of the body, and if your eye is healthy, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eye is bad, your whole body will be full of darkness. Then if the light in you is darkness, how great is the darkness? So Jesus is using the metaphor. The metaphor here is of 2 kinds of eyes. One eye is basically good, which is the word haplos is described as single-minded or healthy or generous, and the other eye is basically evil or bad. And depending on which eye, will determine where your treasure is, which will then determine the course of your life. I was outside Sunway Pyramid the other day on Costa's Coffee, and I always have coffee there. And just across the coffee house, you would see huge lines of people. And I don't know why they were lining up until somebody explained to me that they were lining up outside the Adidas shop. Now, why would you line up for hours outside the Adidas shop with even social distancing? It's because they want to buy Adidas shoes. I thought Adidas shoes were only for footballers. No, but these Adidas shoes were always sold as limited editions, and you could actually resell it and make some money doing it. And so therefore, people perceived Adidas shoes were worth the wait, and so therefore it is where their hearts were drawn to, and so therefore it was their treasure. So whatever is your treasure is determined by your perspective. You could look at an ordinary situation. For example, a whole bunch of Nepali workers coming out from the airport. You could see two things. If you have a good eye, if you have a bad eye, you will see an opportunity to use these people as cheap labor and basically to abuse them. Or you could see them as wonderful people for another country with opportunity for you to show them love and generosity and actually learn from their particular culture. So whatever is your treasure is determined by your perspective, which is what Jesus is trying to get at. If you have a bad eye, then you will see everything from the perspective of greed. If you have a good eye, then you will see everything in the light of kingdom values. In fact, Martin Luther says, whenever the gospel is taught and people seek to live according to it, there are two terrible plagues that always arise. False preachers who corrupt the teaching, and then Sir Greed, who obstruct righteous living. In Luke chapter 12, verse 13, someone in the crowd said to him, which is Jesus, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." But he said to him, "Man, who made me a judge or arbiter over you?" And he said to them, "Take care and be on your guard against all covetousness, for one's life does not consist in the abundance." So it's interesting to look at this verse. You see, Jesus never tells us to watch out. You might be committing adultery. Watch out. You might be murdering someone or stealing some money. Because when we steal, when we murder, we know we have sinned. But most of us, when it comes to greed or covetousness, that means you're desiring what other people have, we have difficulty recognizing it in ourselves. That's why Jesus tells us to watch out. That's the sin that is underneath the surface. It's so natural that we don't know that we're sinning. You see, greed is the underlying principle in the whole of our society. Profit is good. We live in a greedy society. The only difference is that we hide it so well. The only a crisis will bring it up. For example, the COVID-19 crisis, you remember, huge lines of people going to the supermarket buying more than what they actually need. Remember the mad rush for toilet paper. Some people stack up the shopping carts right up like a mountain, and other people fight for it on the aisles, women tearing each other up, and then other people have no toilet paper at all. The other issue why greed is difficult to detect is that the definition, the American Heritage Dictionary, describes greed as excessive desire to acquire or possess more than one needs or deserves, especially with respect to material wealth. It's such a fuzzy definition. We have difficulty recognizing it because what is excessive desire? When does desire turn into greed? When is greed so excessive? Is there a difference between greed and ambition? What is the difference between what one person deserves and another person needs? So these are all difficulties. See, money also blinds us to our lifestyle choices. If you were to buy a handphone, it's a sliding scale. You could buy one for 300 ringgit, you could buy one for 1,000 ringgit, you could buy one for 3,000 ringgit, you could buy one for much more than that. Same with houses. You could live in a terrace house, a single-story house, a bungalow house, a good suburb, medium-class suburb. Whatever suburb that you are, there'll always be somebody who's actually living better than you. So that basically there is no end. So therefore, because there's no end, it's very difficult to detect greed. Now, greed also blinds us as to how we actually work and contribute to society. They did this experiment in 2004 by these researchers called James Heyman and Dan Ariely. What they did was actually, they were asked three groups of people to draw circles on a computer screen. One group was asked to do it as a favor. Another group was asked to do it for 50 cents. And last group was asked to do this for $5. And after timing all the subjects, they actually evaluated it. And it turned out that the ones who did the task, drawing the circles on the computer as a favor, did it the fastest. The next group, surprise, surprise, was the ones who did it for $5. And the worst ones was the one who did it for 50 cents. You see, the ones who did it fastest was the ones who did it for nothing because they did it as a favor. When money is offered as a motivation, the ones who did it for 50 cents did it the slowest because they thought their effort was worth more than 50 cents, so they just didapat attitude and did it slowly. The ones who got $5 thought they were justly paid, and so therefore they did it quickly. So money actually controls how we work. So perhaps that's why a lot of places, government servants all over the world, because they're poorly paid, actually work very poorly. Money also affects our ethics. Remember, years ago, there was a CEO of a large oil company called Enron, which collapsed because of a lot of embezzlement of money and unethical things. If you actually look back into Jeffrey Skilling's time spent at business school, his professor once asked him that if you actually had a product and you knew this product would cause harm to society, would you continue to sell it? And you know what Jeffrey Skilling said? He said, I will continue to sell that product because that's my responsibility to maximize shareholder value, and the government's job is to catch me, is to regulate me. And that, unfortunately, is the mindset of a lot of business people all over the world. So in conclusion, Jesus is saying what we consider as our treasure is very important because our perspective is very important. It's like our eyes, they can be wholesome and generous, and then they'll determine the way you live. We will be righteous and godly, or it can be evil or greedy. But the question, what will determine our perspective? What causes us to see things in a generous, godly way? Or what causes us to see in an evil way, in a greedy way, in an envious way, with a wrong perspective in life? What's the difference? So this brings us to our final section, which is the incompatibility of discipleship and greed, which is taken from verse 24. Now, no one can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to one and despise the other, looks down on the other. You cannot serve God and money. Now, let's look at the original Greek. The original Greek translates this word in a very funny word called mammon, which is the Greek transliteration of Aramaic, which is the colloquial language they used in those days. Aramaic, mammon means property or possessions or money, things that you possess. So it's a broad term that, all the physical goods that are of any value in the world, including services. And this is important because 15% of what Jesus said in all his teachings always relate to money and possessions. And this is more than all his teachings on heaven and hell combined. 16 out of 38 parables which he told actually relates to how we handle money. So the whole issue is wholeness. The disciple must be whole and single-minded and generous. What kind of perspective in life one has will actually depend on who is our master. We will love our true master. Now, if you talk to the person in the world, our worldly attitude is completely different. Fund managers will tell us you must diversify your investments, hedge your bets, put your foot one on each part of the world. The problem is you can't hedge your bets, you can't diversify because you know what? You have only one life to invest and you can't break that life up. The other reason is that what Jesus says, you can't have two masters because you eventually will love one and you will actually hate the other. Jesus says one cannot serve both God and mammon because it is a matter of the heart. One will be hated and the other will be loved. One will be a subject of devotion, the others will be despised. Choosing between God's kingdom and the goods of the world is not merely a matter of cold thinking. It is actually a matter of your heart. Now, if we worship mammon, that means every cent I give to the poor is one less ringgit for me to spend on what I really like. So I don't really like the poor or the weak. I look down on them. I despise them because every dollar I spend on them is $1 less for me. If I worship mammon, I will look down on full-time pastors or leaders because they're always looking for my money, my ringgit, and every dollar I give them means one less for me. If I worship mammon, time spent on discipleship, church services, Bible study is less time spent on my own business. Eventually our hearts will cool to the extent that we will despise the other. You see, our perspectives on any event are always determined by what we worship and regard as valuable. In Matthew 13, verse 44, Jesus describes the kingdom of God as like a treasure hidden in a field where a man found and covered up. Then in his joy, he goes and sells all that he has and buy that field. You see, what Jesus is saying is that the man's perspective is determined by what he knows is valuable. For most people looking in the field, they see lalang, acres of dirt, hot sun and weeds, and they're not going to have anything to do with it. They won't sell their car even to buy it. But this man saw something, he saw value. Some years ago, Jeffrey Chia, the Sunway boss, was speaking to a bunch of us who are doctors, and he told us his story. He stood at the edge of what other people would have regarded as a huge pile of dirt and sand, which is shifting in a mining pool at Sunway. People walked away, but he saw profit. He saw special pilings, bungalows, semi-Ds, houses, condominiums, and he saw profit. And you look at Sunway, what it is today. You see, what you see is determined by what is valuable to you, what you consider as your treasure. Look at our own lives. What is our treasure? The only way to tell where our treasure is, see where our money goes effortlessly. If you spend money on books without even thinking about it, which means knowledge, the basis is the basis of your self-esteem because you spend it like water because it's important to you. If you spend on clothes or jewelry or trips and all those things you don't even think about, this will indicate where your treasure or idol is. But the point is, what Jesus is trying to tell us is that we have to use all these gifts in the service of whom we serve, whether it's God or mammon. In Luke chapter 16, verse 8 onwards, there's a parable where Jesus tells of a shrewd manager who knew that he would be dismissed. He worked for somebody, and what he did was, before he was dismissed, he went to each of the people who actually owed money to his master. And you know what he did? He gave them a discount. And everybody is really happy. They formed good relationship, good kamching with each person. Why? Because he had done them a favor. So that when he was actually without a job, they would welcome him, they would give him help, they will find him a new job, they'll provide for his family because he did them a favor. And Luke 16:8, let me read to you. The master commended the dishonest manager for his shrewdness. For the sons of the world are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than the sons of light. And I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of unrighteous wealth, so that when it fails, they may receive you into eternal dwellings. And so what he's saying to us is that basically we are given a responsibility. And the money actually is not ours, it actually belongs to God. How you use it will be for eternal value or non-eternal values. If you look in verse 10, the one who is faithful in very little is also faithful in much. One who is dishonest in very little is also dishonest in much. If then I tell you, if you've not been faithful in unrighteous wealth, who will entrust you to true riches? And if you have not been faithful in that which is another's, who will give you what is your own? No servant can serve two masters, for either he will hate one and love the other, or he will be devoted to one and he will despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon. What it's saying is that God has given us money in our possession. We are to be faithful. And how are we to be faithful? We are going to use money for eternal values. How you spend your money determines on who you worship. If you worship our Lord Jesus Christ, the money that you will spend effortlessly will be for the kingdom of God. If you serve mammon, the money you spend without even thinking about it will be for everything else. There was a businessman, this is a story told by Pastor Jason Lim from Singapore, who came to his church pastor and said, you know, Pastor, I see the needs in your church, and here's a check for 100,000 to the ministry of the poor and the gospel. And he handed a check to the pastor, who was overjoyed. Just as he was leaving, he received an SMS, and he and the pastor saw the SMS, and it actually said, "So boss, sorry to tell you, your ship has sunk and all the cargo is lost." And the businessman then turned around to pastor, "Pastor, I'm sorry, can I have my check back?" The pastor said, "Well, I totally understand. I mean, you lost your whole ship and the cargo." And the businessman took the check, thought for a while, tore it up, threw the pieces in the dustbin. And you know what he did? He whipped out his checkbook again and wrote another check, another pastor, and handed that to the pastor. And the pastor expected a smaller check because the guy's got less money, right? He took out a check, you know what it read? $200,000. And the pastor said, "Oh, what happened? I thought you just lost your goods in your ship." You know what the man said? The man said, "Yeah, I did. You know this SMS? It's from heaven, telling me that I should not lay up treasure on earth." You see, when catastrophe hits, it shows us in our lives that what we actually treasure, the money that you have, doesn't belong to us, and it's so fleeting. You either use it for the kingdom or you use it for yourself. And the one that you use for yourself, you can't take with you. What is the solution? The solution is in 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 18. And we, with unveiled face, beholding the glory of the Lord, are being transformed into the same image from one degree of glory to another. And this comes from the Lord who is the Spirit. You see, who do we worship will determine how we spend our money. And if we worship our Lord Jesus Christ, we keep looking at His glory. How do we look at His glory? We look into the Word of God. We study the Word of God. We are immersed in the Word of God. And the Word of God becomes more beautiful to us each day. And as it becomes more beautiful, as it percolates into our lives and changes our spiritual DNA, then we begin to see the world in a different light. And we begin to spend our money in a different way. When we worship Jesus Christ, the most beautiful Lord who gave His treasure, left heaven to give His life for us. May God bless all of us as we grapple with the issue of money, because this is a serious problem which affects every single one of us. Amen.